The billionaire replayed the footage again and again. His deaf son had just reacted to a sound. That wasn't possible, because for years, the boy had lived in complete silence. But what the cameras captured that night wasn't just unexpected. It was impossible. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard Cole had built his life on certainty, on numbers that never lied, on systems that always made sense. Yet nothing in his world could explain what he was seeing on that screen. And for a man who controlled everything, that was the one thing he feared most. Years earlier, Richard Cole had been known as a man who could fix anything, a billionaire whose decisions shaped industries and whose name carried weight in every room he entered. But inside his own home, there was one problem no amount of money could solve, and it began the night his wife never made it back from the hospital. Their son, Ethan Cole, was only 5 when the silence took over his world, not the kind of silence that comes from quiet rooms or empty spaces, but the kind that settles deep inside a person after loss, the kind doctors struggled to explain, calling it rare, complex, tied to trauma, leaving Richard with reports filled with technical language but no real answers. And over time, that silence became the defining reality of the house they lived in. The mansion that once echoed with laughter turned into a place governed by precision and control, where every movement was calculated and every sound carefully managed, as if structure could replace what had been lost, and Richard made sure of it, installing rules that every employee followed without question, schedules that left no room for error, and eventually, cameras that watched every corner of the property, not out of curiosity, but out of a need to ensure nothing slipped beyond his control again, because after losing his wife, unpredictability was something he refused to allow into his life, even if it meant turning his home into something that felt less like a place of comfort and more like a system that needed constant monitoring. Ethan grew up in that controlled silence, his world defined by gestures, routines, and the distant presence of a father who cared deeply but struggled to connect. And while the best specialists in the country had been brought in to help him, each one left with the same conclusion, that Ethan's condition was unlikely to change, that progress would be limited, and that acceptance was the only path forward, something Richard refused to embrace, choosing instead to double down on structure, believing that if he could not fix the problem, he could at least contain it, keep it from getting worse, keep everything steady, predictable, and under control, even if that meant missing the subtle shifts happening right in front of him. Then Maria Lopez arrived, a quiet presence among a staff trained to remain invisible, someone who did her work without drawing attention, yet somehow stood out in ways Richard couldn't immediately explain, not because she broke rules, but because she didn't seem shaped by them, moving through the house with a calm confidence that didn't fit the rigid environment he had created, and at first, she was just another employee, another name on a list, until small details began to surface, moments, caught not by Richard's eyes, but by the cameras he relied on, moments that didn't align with the order he had worked so hard to maintain. It started with something simple, almost too small to matter. Ethan lingering near Maria longer than usual, watching her in a way he didn't watch others, his attention fixed not on what she was doing, but on how she moved, how her lips formed words even though he couldn't hear them. And while anyone else might have dismissed it as coincidence, Richard noticed patterns, and patterns always meant something. So he went back to the footage, reviewing it carefully, frame by frame, until those small moments began to connect, revealing something he hadn't expected, that Maria wasn't just cleaning or completing tasks, she was engaging with Ethan in ways no one else had tried. On one recording, she sat beside him, speaking softly while her hands moved in deliberate, measured gestures, not random, not accidental, but intentional, and Ethan watched closely, his eyes following every movement, every shape, every pause, as if he were trying to understand something just out of reach, and Richard felt a shift in his chest, not yet fear, not yet anger, but something closer to uncertainty. Because this wasn't part of the plan, this wasn't something he had approved, and in his world, anything outside the system demanded explanation. Yet as he continued watching, what he saw didn't fit into any explanation he had prepared himself to accept. Another clip showed Maria placing her hand lightly against the surface beside Ethan, tapping a slow, steady rhythm, her expression calm, focused, patient, and for a moment, nothing happened, just the quiet repetition of motion in a silent room, until suddenly, Ethan responded, not with sound, but with recognition, his body reacting in time with the pattern, his attention sharpening, his movements aligning with something he wasn't supposed to perceive, and Richard paused the footage, replayed it, slowed it down, searching for an error, a misinterpretation, anything that would make sense of what he was seeing. But there was none, only the undeniable fact that his son was responding to something that should not have reached him. As the days passed, the footage revealed more, not dramatic changes, not sudden transformations, but steady, undeniable progress. Ethan beginning to mirror Maria's gestures, to anticipate her movements, to engage in a form of communication that bypassed the limitations every specialist had described. And with each new clip, Richard's certainty weakened, replaced by a question he could no longer ignore, not about Maria, but about everything he had been told, everything he had believed about his son's condition. And for the first time in years, the possibility that something had been missed began to take hold. Determined to understand, Richard brought in another specialist, presenting the evidence without explanation, watching closely as the expert reviewed the recordings, and when the analysis came back, it carried a conclusion that shifted everything. Not a miracle, not an impossibility, but something grounded in science, a rare neurological response where trauma had disrupted Ethan's ability to process sound, not eliminated it entirely, meaning the potential had always been there, waiting for the right stimulus, the right approach, something traditional methods had failed to provide, and what Maria had done, without formal training, without advanced technology, was tap into that pathway through rhythm, through connection, through a level of patience that no structured system had ever achieved. Richard sat alone after hearing that explanation, the weight of it settling in slowly, not just the realization that his son could reach beyond the silence, but that it had taken someone outside his carefully controlled world to make it happen, someone who didn't follow his rules, didn't rely on his systems, and didn't need his approval to try something different. And for a man who had spent years believing control was the answer, that realization was harder to accept than the footage itself, because it meant acknowledging that the one thing he had avoided, uncertainty, was the very thing that had opened a door he thought was permanently closed. In the days that followed, the cameras remained on, but Richard stopped watching them the same way, no longer searching for problems to fix, but observing moments he had previously overlooked, seeing his son not as a case to manage, but as a person rediscovering something that had been buried beneath years of silence. And for the first time since that night at the hospital, the house began to change, not through rules or systems, but through something far less controlled, something that couldn't be measured or predicted, yet carried more impact than anything Richard had built. And as Ethan continued to respond, to connect, to move beyond the boundaries once placed around him, Richard understood that what the cameras had captured wasn't just evidence of progress. It was proof that some things don't respond to control, they respond to connection, and in a home once defined by silence, the first real change didn't come from power or precision. It came from a moment that no system could have created. Richard Cole was a man who built his empire on precision, a billionaire whose world operated on control, discipline, and absolute certainty. Yet inside the walls of his own mansion, there was a silence no amount of power could break. The estate was vast, flawless, and perfectly managed, but it felt empty in a way that no design could fix, because at the center of it all was his son, Ethan Cole, a boy who hadn't heard a single sound since the night his world changed forever. Ethan moved through life withdrawn and distant, communicating only when necessary, his emotions guarded behind a quiet that even the best specialists in the country had failed to reach. And over time, Richard stopped expecting change, choosing instead to maintain order, to keep everything stable, predictable, and under control, as if structure alone could protect what remained of his family. But then Maria Lopez entered that controlled world, a new maid who didn't fit the rhythm of the house, not because she broke rules, but because she carried something different in the way she moved, a calm presence that stood out against the rigid silence surrounding her. She spoke softly even when no one responded, lingered a little longer in places others passed through quickly, and seemed completely unaffected by the tension that defined the mansion. and at first, Richard paid little attention, because people like her came and went, easily replaceable, easily forgotten, until the cameras began to show something he couldn't ignore. Moments that didn't align with routine, interactions that felt subtle yet intentional, and a connection forming between Maria and Ethan that no one else had been able to create. And that was when the questions began to surface, questions Richard couldn't answer, no matter how many times he reviewed the footage. Why was Ethan reacting in ways he never had before, turning his attention toward movements he would normally ignore, focusing on Maria with a level of awareness that hadn't been seen in years? And what exactly was she doing when no one else was watching, speaking softly in empty rooms, using gestures that didn't belong to any instruction Richard had approved, creating moments that felt almost deliberate, as if she understood something about Ethan that no expert had explained? And more than anything, why did a man who trusted systems over people, who relied on evidence over instinct, begin to feel a growing suspicion towards someone who, on the surface, had done nothing wrong, because what Richard was seeing didn't fit into logic, didn't follow the rules he believed in? And for the first time in a long time, he found himself watching not for mistakes, but for answers he couldn't yet understand. Richard Cole didn't believe in chance, and he certainly didn't believe in people acting without reason, which is why every corner of his mansion was covered by hidden cameras, silent observers that fed directly into the one place he trusted more than anything else, a screen filled with undeniable evidence. To him, people were variables, unpredictable and often unreliable, but footage never lied, and that belief had guided him through years of loss, allowing him to maintain control in a world that had once slipped through his hands. Maria Lopez, however, didn't behave like the others, not distant, not mechanical, but calm in a way that felt almost intentional, moving through the house with a quiet confidence that didn't seek approval. And while the rest of the staff followed routines with precision, she seemed to exist slightly outside them, not breaking rules, but not shaped by them either, and that alone was enough to draw Richard's attention. At first, it was something small, barely noticeable unless someone was looking closely, a soft hum that escaped her while she worked, not loud enough to disrupt the silence, but present enough to stand out in a house where even footsteps were measured. And while most would have ignored it, Richard didn't overlook details, especially not in a place where silence had defined every moment of his son's life. Then came the second detail, the one that shifted his attention from curiosity to suspicion. Maria spending more time near Ethan than her duties required, not in obvious ways, not enough to raise immediate concern, but consistently enough to form a pattern, appearing in the same spaces, lingering just a little longer, engaging in quiet moments that weren't part of any instruction he had given. And as the footage accumulated, those moments began to connect in ways Richard couldn't ignore. Ethan, who rarely reacted to anyone, started to behave differently in her presence, his attention drawn toward her movements, his focus sharpening in ways that hadn't been seen in years. And while there was no clear explanation, no direct action that could be labeled as wrong, the change itself was enough to unsettle Richard, because in his world, change without cause was a problem waiting to be understood. He reviewed the recordings more frequently now, isolating clips, replaying interactions, searching for something concrete, something that would confirm what his instincts were beginning to suggest. And yet every time he thought he had found an answer, it slipped just out of reach, leaving behind only more questions, more uncertainty, and a growing sense that something was happening inside his carefully controlled home that he did not fully understand. But then, Richard noticed something strange, not a single moment, not one clear action, but a sequence of details that, when placed together, formed something far more significant than coincidence, something that suggested Maria wasn't just present in Ethan's world, she was influencing it. And for the first time since he installed those cameras, Richard wasn't watching to maintain control, he was watching because control was beginning to slip. It started with a notification that broke the routine Richard Cole depended on, a silent alert from the system he trusted more than anything else, signaling unexpected movement in Ethan Cole's room long after the house had settled into its usual stillness. And for a brief moment, he stared at the screen without moving, the weight of that small disruption settling in before instinct took over. He opened the live feed immediately, his focus narrowing the way it always did when something didn't align with expectation. And what appeared on the monitor wasn't chaos or intrusion, but something far more unsettling in its quiet simplicity. Maria Lopez sitting beside Ethan's bed, her posture calm, her presence steady, as if she belonged there in a moment no one had authorized. And while that alone was enough to raise concern, it was what she was doing that pushed Richard's suspicion further. She was speaking, her voice soft, measured, directed entirely at Ethan, forming words with a patience that suggested she expected to be understood, and Richard felt a sharp tension rise in his chest as he watched, because this made no sense, not within the reality he had spent years accepting, not within the limits every expert had clearly defined. Ethan had lived in complete silence, untouched by sound, unreachable through voice, and yet Maria continued speaking as if none of that existed, as if the rules governing his son's conditions simply did not apply to her. And that contradiction was enough to trigger something deeper than curiosity, something closer to suspicion, because in Richard's world, actions that ignored reality were never harmless. He leaned forward, studying the scene more closely, searching for any sign that this was a misunderstanding, that there was a logical explanation hidden somewhere in the details. But the more he watched, the clearer it became that Maria wasn't hesitating, wasn't testing, wasn't uncertain. She was deliberate, consistent, fully committed to an approach that defied everything Richard believed to be true about Ethan's condition. And that raised a question he couldn't ignore, one that cut through every layer of logic he relied on. Why was she talking to someone who couldn't hear her? The thought repeated in his mind as he reached for the controls, slowing the footage, isolating the moment, determined to find the answer hidden within it, because whatever was happening in that room was no longer something he could dismiss as harmless behavior. The room remained still, the interaction quiet, yet filled with a tension Richard couldn't explain, and as Maria continued speaking, her expression calm, her focus entirely on Ethan, there was something else beneath the surface, something subtle that didn't immediately reveal itself, something that required closer inspection, and Richard knew he wasn't seeing the full picture yet. He adjusted the zoom, bringing the image tighter, sharper, removing everything unnecessary until only the details remained, every movement, every shift, every expression captured with clarity, and it was in that moment, as the screen filled with a closer view of what had previously gone unnoticed, that Richard prepared himself for whatever explanation might finally emerge. That's when he zoomed in. Richard Cole isolated the footage and began moving through it frame by frame, the way he analyzed every deal he had ever closed, searching for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that could explain what instinct alone could not. And as the seconds stretched into minutes, the ordinary details of the room started to fall away, leaving only the interaction between Maria Lopez and Ethan Cole at the center of his attention. At first glance, it appeared routine. Ethan lying still, Maria seated beside him, her posture calm, her movements controlled. But as Richard slowed the playback further, something became clear that he had missed at normal speed. Ethan wasn't asleep, not fully, his eyes slightly open, fixed in a way that suggested focus rather than rest, and more importantly, they were locked onto Maria's face, tracking the subtle movement of her lips with an intensity that hadn't been present in years. Richard leaned closer to the screen, replaying the same sequence again, and this time he noticed what came next, Maria's hands moving gently, deliberately, not random gestures, not unconscious motion, but structured communication, the kind he had seen specialists attempt countless times without success. Except this was different, slower, more patient, shaped to Ethan rather than forcing Ethan to adapt. And as those movements continued, something even more unexpected followed, Ethan responding. Not immediately, not perfectly, but unmistakably, his fingers shifting, hesitating, then forming rough versions of the same shapes, as if he were recalling something buried deep rather than learning it for the first time. And Richard felt the certainty he had relied on for years begin to fracture under the weight of what he was witnessing. He moved forward through the footage, each second revealing more than the last, Ethan becoming more engaged, more present, his reactions growing clearer, more intentional, until it was impossible to deny that communication was happening in that room without his knowledge, without his permission, and more importantly, without any of the controlled methods he had trusted for so long. For a brief moment, Richard considered the possibility that this was coincidence, a series of disconnected actions misinterpreted through careful observation. But that explanation collapsed as quickly as it formed, because the pattern was too consistent, the responses too aligned, and Maria's movements too precise to be accidental, leaving him with a realization he wasn't prepared to accept, that something real was happening between them, something that had developed beyond his control. He paused the footage, letting the silence of the room settle in around him. The same silence that had defined his home for years, yet now it felt different, no longer empty, but filled with unanswered questions. And as he prepared to continue, to dig deeper, to find the exact moment where this shift began, he expected more of the same, more gestures, more responses, more gradual progress that he could analyze and eventually understand. But what came next was not gradual, not subtle, and not something he could immediately explain, because in the very next sequence, everything changed in a way that forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about his son. But the next moment changed everything. When the footage resumed, Richard Cole expected more of the same. Gestures, quiet persistence, small progress he could eventually explain, but what unfolded in the next sequence forced him to reconsider everything at once, because Maria Lopez shifted her approach in a way that didn't rely on words or signs alone. She placed her hand lightly against the edge of the bed, her movements slow and deliberate, and then she began to tap, not randomly, not absent-mindedly, but in a steady, controlled rhythm that repeated with precision, each beat spaced carefully, as if it carried meaning beyond simple motion. At first, nothing changed. The room remained still, the silence unchanged, and for a brief moment, it seemed like just another attempt, another method that would lead nowhere. But Richard didn't look away, because something in her consistency suggested intention, something that demanded to be understood. Then it happened, not gradually, not uncertainly, but instantly. Ethan reacted, his body shifting in perfect alignment with the rhythm before him, his attention locking onto the pattern as if he recognized it, not as something new, but as something familiar, something that reached him in a way no voice ever had. Richard leaned closer, replaying the moment again, watching the exact point of reaction, expecting to find hesitation or delay, anything that would suggest coincidence. But there was none. Ethan anticipated the rhythm, responding just before each tap landed, his movements synchronized in a way that couldn't be accidental, and that realization carried a weight Richard couldn't ignore. This wasn't random behavior. This wasn't imagination. This was response, clear, measurable, undeniable response. As the sequence continued, Maria adjusted the rhythm, faster, slower, changing the pattern deliberately, and each time, Ethan followed, adapting, predicting, engaging with something that bypassed the silence that had defined his world for years. And in that moment, the explanation Richard had been searching for began to take shape, not through assumption, but through evidence unfolding directly in front of him. She wasn't just helping him communicate in ways specialists had failed to achieve. She was reaching him through a completely different pathway, one that didn't rely on hearing in the traditional sense, but on something more fundamental, something physical, something that could be felt even in complete silence. And as that understanding settled in, Richard realized that Maria hadn't ignored reality. She had approached it from an angle no one else had considered. The implication of that realization was immediate and overwhelming. Because if Ethan could respond to rhythm, if he could anticipate patterns through vibration, then the boundaries Richard had accepted for years were not as fixed as he believed, and for the first time, the silence that had once felt absolute now seemed incomplete, as if there had always been a connection waiting beneath it, unnoticed, untouched, until someone patient enough chose to reach for it in a different way. Richard sat back slightly, the footage still playing, the rhythm continuing, Ethan responding again and again, and in that moment, control gave way to something else, something unfamiliar, because what he was witnessing wasn't just progress, it was possibility, emerging from a method he had never considered, delivered by someone he had once dismissed as insignificant. Richard Cole didn't wait. Not this time. Not after what he had just seen. Because for the first time in years, the footage in front of him wasn't raising questions he could ignore, It was demanding answers he could no longer delay, and within hours, he had a specialist reviewing every second of the recordings, every movement, every response, every detail that had once seemed impossible. He presented the evidence without explanation, allowing the analysis to speak for itself. Watching closely as the experts studied the interaction between Maria Lopez and Ethan Cole with the same intensity Richard had shown, and when the results finally came, they didn't describe a miracle, they didn't describe an error, they described something far more unsettling in its simplicity. Something that had been missed not because it was hidden, but because no one had looked at it the right way. Ethan had never been completely unreachable, not in the way Richard had been told, not in the way the reports had suggested, because while his world had been silent, it hadn't been empty, and the difference between those two truths changed everything. The specialist explained that Ethan's condition wasn't a total loss of hearing, but a neurological response shaped by trauma, a protective barrier his mind had formed after the night his mother died, blocking sound not as a failure of the ears, but as a defense within the brain, something rare, difficult to diagnose, and even harder to reverse. For years, every method had focused on restoring what was assumed to be lost, but Maria had done something entirely different without realizing it. She hadn't tried to force sound back into Ethan's world. She had found another way in. Through rhythm, through touch, through consistent presence, Maria had activated a pathway that had remained untouched, bypassing the barrier that had kept Ethan disconnected, and what Richard had witnessed on those cameras wasn't an anomaly. It was the result of that connection taking hold, slowly at first, then with clarity that could no longer be denied. It wasn't advanced treatment. It wasn't a breakthrough driven by technology or controlled environments. It was something far more human, something that couldn't be programmed or predicted, and that realization carried a weight Richard hadn't felt in years, because it meant that everything he had built to protect his son had never reached the part of him that needed it most. He sat with that understanding longer than he expected, the silence around him no longer feeling like an absence, but like something that had been waiting to change. And as the footage continued to play in his mind, the taps, the responses, the moments of recognition, he understood that what had unlocked Ethan wasn't force, wasn't precision, and wasn't control. It was connection, simple, patient, and unmeasured, delivered by someone who never needed permission to try. And for a man who had spent years believing answers came from systems he could manage, the truth he now faced was far more difficult to accept, because it meant that the one thing he couldn't control had been the key all along. For the first time since the cameras were installed, Richard Cole did something he never thought he would do. He reached for the system that had defined his sense of control for years, paused the live feeds, and slowly removed access, not out of frustration, not out of defeat, but out of understanding that what mattered most in that house could no longer be measured through a screen. The silence that once justified every decision he made no longer felt like something to monitor, because it had already begun to change in ways no system could track. And as he stepped away from the control room, the weight he had carried for years shifted into something unfamiliar, something closer to trust, not just in Maria Lopez, but in the process he had once refused to accept. He no longer needed to analyze every moment, no longer needed to question every interaction, because the evidence had already shown him what he had been unwilling to see. That connection could succeed where control had failed, and that realization changed more than just the way he viewed his son. It changed the way he understood everything he had built his life around. Ethan Cole was no longer just existing within silence. He was moving beyond it, responding, engaging, rediscovering something that had been buried beneath years of distance. And for the first time, Richard allowed himself to experience that change without interference, without the need to manage it, simply present in a way he hadn't been before. Maria remained the same, calm, steady, never seeking recognition, continuing the same quiet approach that had made all the difference. And in those moments, the house itself began to feel different, no longer defined by what was missing, but by what was slowly returning. Richard stood in the hallway outside Ethan's room one evening, not watching through a screen, not analyzing footage, but listening in the only way he could now understand, aware that something had shifted in a way that couldn't be reversed. And as that realization settled in, it carried a meaning far greater than anything he had expected. And in a house built on silence, the first thing he finally heard Was his son coming back? Do you think this was science or something deeper? What would you have done in his position?